12 years old, hiding in a public library. 15, running away to Chicago to hear Bertrand Russell lecture. 20, co-writing the 4-page paper that defined every artificial intelligence today. 46, dead of cirrhosis. The mathematics every neural network in the world runs on was invented by a teenager who taught himself logic in a public library. And the field that owes him everything filed his name on a hyphen. This is the case of Walter Pitts. The neuron inside every transformer layer of ChatGPT. The neuron inside every convolutional layer of every image classifier. The neuron inside every artificial brain currently making forecasts, generating text, driving cars. The mathematical object known as the McCulloch-Pitts neuron. There is a name on it. There is also a missing name, and the missing name is the one that did the work. Every transformer layer inside ChatGPT, Claude and Gemini is a stack of formal neurons described in a single 1943 paper. 4 printed pages. The teenager who invented that neuron never finished a doctorate. He did not live to see his model run on a single computer. By the time the personal computer arrived in 1976, Walter Pitts had been dead for 7 years. Walter Harry Pitts Jr. was born on April 23, 1923 in Detroit, Michigan. His father was a boilermaker. The household, by every account from neighbors and from Pitts's later friends, was violent. His father beat him for reading. At age 12 in 1935, neighborhood bullies chased Walter Pitts through the streets of Detroit. He ducked into the local public library to hide. He stayed for 3 days. By the time he came out, he had read all 3 volumes of Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead's Principia Mathematica cover to cover. The library kept him alive for the next 3 years. He returned almost daily. He had no money. He had no friend in the building. What he did have was an unsupervised public library and a Detroit winter that made the reading rooms warmer than home. By the end of his first month, he was reading Greek. By the end of his second, he was reading Latin. The Principia was the foundational text of mathematical logic. 3 volumes, several thousand pages, the work that took Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead more than a decade to write. Pitts read it inside 3 days and identified what he believed were errors. According to the surviving accounts, including the biographical study published by Neil Smallheiser in 2000, the 12-year-old Pitts sat down and wrote a letter to Bertrand Russell at the University of Cambridge in England. The letter identified what Pitts believed were serious errors in the first volume of the Principia. Russell received it. Russell wrote back encouragingly. Pitts was 12. He had no high school diploma, no transcripts, and no funds. He stayed in Detroit and kept reading. 3 years later, in 1938, Bertrand Russell came to him. Russell delivered a visiting lecture series at the University of Chicago. Walter Pitts, 15 years old, ran away from home for the last time. He hitchhiked to Chicago to attend the lectures. He sat in the audience. He never went home. He never saw his family again. He stayed in Chicago, sleeping rough, and started auditing university courses without enrolling. Because he had no high school diploma, no transcripts, and no funds. In a Chicago park that same year, he met another homeless teenager named Jerome Lettvin. They became lifelong friends. Lettvin would later author the paper that broke Pitts's life work. At the University of Chicago in those years, there was a small group called the Mathematical Biophysics Committee, run by a Ukrainian-born physiologist named Nicholas Reshevsky. The group studied whether biological systems, nerves, neurons, brains, could be described by mathematics. Pitts, with no degree and no enrollment, began auditing the seminars. Within a year, he was correcting the calculations of doctorate-holding researchers in the room. He was paid nothing. He was given nothing. He continued sleeping on couches and floors of friends across Chicago for the next 3 years. In 1942, Jerome Lettvin introduced Walter Pitts to a 43-year-old American neurophysiologist named Warren McCulloch. McCulloch was a chairholder, formal, published, eccentric. Pitts was 19, slightly built, severely shy, with no fixed address. McCulloch invited him to stay at his family home outside Chicago. Pitts moved in. He lived in McCulloch's house for the next several months. They worked through the nights at McCulloch's kitchen table. McCulloch had a question. He believed the brain was running some form of logical computation and that the firing of a single neuron could be modeled as a logical operation. Fire or not fire, true or false. He needed a mathematician to formalize it. Pitts already had the mathematics. The two of them, across roughly 18 months of work, produced 4 pages. The title of the paper was A Logical Calculus of the Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity. It was published in the Bulletin of Mathematical Biophysics in 1943. What the paper proved was that any computation expressible in symbolic logic, any logical statement, any Boolean operation, any function describable by formal rules, could be performed by a network of artificial neurons, each one a simple threshold unit. Fire above a threshold. Stay silent below it. Connect enough of them in the right configuration and you can compute anything. This is the artificial neuron. This is the substrate of every neural network in operation on the planet today. This is what Pitts and McCulloch built on the McCulloch kitchen table outside Chicago, while Pitts had no diploma, no salary, and no home of his own. In 1944, the mathematician Norbert Wiener, already famous for his work on anti-aircraft fire control during the war, read the Pitts and McCulloch paper. He traveled to Chicago. He met Pitts. He decided immediately that Pitts belonged at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Wiener arranged a research associate position with no formal credential requirements. Pitts, 21 years old, no high school diploma, no undergraduate degree, no driver's license, moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts in the autumn of 1944. He stayed at MIT for the next 25 years. Between 1946 and 1953, the Macy Foundation in New York hosted a series of closed conferences, the Macy Conferences on Cybernetics. The gatherings invented the field of cybernetics. Around the table were Norbert Wiener, Warren McCulloch, Margaret Mead, John von Neumann, Claude Shannon, Heinz von Förster, Gregory Bateson, Jerome Lettvin, and Walter Pitts. Pitts spoke quietly. He wrote with a typewriter balanced on his lap, having declined a desk. He never published a book. He carried no papers. He lived in a single rented room in Cambridge. In 1955, at the urging of Jerome Lettvin and Warren McCulloch, MIT prepared to award Walter Pitts a doctorate without requiring a thesis. The faculty understood that he was already operating at a level that demanded a doctorate, but he had no high school diploma to formally qualify for the doctoral track. Pitts refused to sign the acceptance papers. He refused all advanced degrees, including the honorary ones. The only earned credential on record beside his name was an Associate of Arts from the University of Chicago, given to him in retrospect for his work on the 1943 paper. Then came the frog. In November of 1959, the Proceedings of the Institute of Radio Engineers published a paper. Its title was What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. The authors were Jerome Lettvin, Humberto Maturana, Warren McCulloch, and Walter Pitts. The paper presented the results of experimental neurophysiology, actual electrodes placed in actual frog retinas, recording how the visual neurons fired in response to actual moving stimuli. What the frog's eye actually did was nothing like what the 1943 model predicted. The frog's retinal neurons fired in spatial and temporal patterns that no clean logical threshold could explain. They were doing something messier, more analog, more entangled with the body of the frog. The biology, observed directly, refused to match the mathematics. The senior author of the new paper was Lettvin, Pitts's oldest friend, the homeless teenager from Chicago in 1938. The fourth author was Pitts himself. He had read the data. He had signed off on the conclusion. And the conclusion was that the framework he had built his life around could not by itself explain a real brain. Pitts went home from MIT to his rented room in Cambridge. He had been working, for roughly 15 years, on a doctoral thesis. The thesis was an extension of the 1943 formal neuron model. It was nearly complete. According to multiple accounts from Lettvin and from the biographical record compiled by Smallheiser, Pitts burned the thesis. He did not submit it. He did not publish it. He stopped writing new technical papers. There was a second injury. Around 1952, Norbert Wiener's wife, Margaret, had told her husband a lie. She had said that several of McCulloch's protégés, including Jerome Lettvin and Walter Pitts, had behaved improperly toward the Wiener's daughter Barbara during a visit. The accusation was false. Wiener believed it. He cut off all contact with Pitts and Lettvin immediately. The truth came out years later. Wiener never reopened the friendship. Pitts had lost his most influential professional protector before the frog paper. After it, he was alone. He continued to occupy his MIT research associate position on paper. He drank. He stopped attending Macy Conference reunions. His friends from MIT, Lettvin in particular, visited his rented room and tried to intervene. Pitts read constantly. He kept reading philosophy, biology, and physics. He published almost nothing for the rest of his life. By the early 1960s, he was severely alcoholic. By 1968, he was no longer leaving the apartment. On May 14, 1969, Walter Pitts died of bleeding esophageal varices, a complication of cirrhosis of the liver. He was 46 years old. He was buried with no monument and no doctoral title beside his name. The 1943 paper outlived him. By the late 1950s, the psychologist Frank Rosenblatt had added trainable weights to the formal neuron and called the result the perceptron. By the mid-1980s, Geoffrey Hinton, David Rumelhart, and Ronald Williams had added the backpropagation algorithm for learning those weights. By 2017, the architecture known as the transformer had stacked millions of weighted formal neurons into the model behind every contemporary large language model. ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. Every one of them runs gradient descent across descendants of the four-page 1943 abstraction. The mathematical object at the center of it is, in every textbook, called the McCulloch-Pitts neuron. Two names, hyphenated, the hyphen places McCulloch first, the hyphen places Pitts second. McCulloch was the chairholder, the doctorate, the introduction writer, the senior figure. The teenager who did the mathematics, who had read the Principia in 3 days at age 12, whose hand drafted the calculus inside that paper, sits on the right side of the hyphen. He is cited tens of thousands of times. His name almost never appears alone. There is no statue of Walter Pitts. There is no biography on a shelf in a bookshop. There is no Wikipedia info box photograph because almost no photographs of him exist. The Detroit library where he taught himself the symbolic logic that underwrites every artificial intelligence in operation today does not mark the room. The field that owes him everything filed his name on a hyphen and then largely forgot the hyphen. There's a name on the patent. There's another name on the work. Subscribe. We'll find the second one.